Kathleen and Marky, which one which? Kathleen and Marky. So it's great to have you here. First of all, welcome to everybody that was able to take time out today to come talk about GPS, one of my favorite subjects. We've been doing GPS a long time now, and we get caught up in the world that we live in many times. And the world that we live in is the military world, but GPS is a public utility everywhere around the world. So the gentleman that we have up here, welcome. It's great to have you here. It's great to have your wives here as well. I'm glad you got to spend the day. Did you guys get to go to those two stops as well?
Yes.
It's pretty interesting. So the interesting part is, how many people in the room have been to two stops? About half. So half the command is about inside the second place operations water. And that would be about typical. We grew up in different worlds, different people, but everybody understands GPS. Everybody understands what it is. But these gentlemen have looked at it in a different way. So without further ado, I'm going to sit down and listen. Have a good time with the rest of you guys. Thanks for coming out, spending the afternoon. Let's get over to you.
Well, thanks for that kind introduction, General Hayden. Let me first start by introducing some of our distinguished visitors. As some of you might know, we've been sponsoring these lectures in conjunction with the National Security Space Institute. The Commandant, Richard Van Hook, is here today with us. My counterpart in getting these speeches and lectures done has been Jim Moshkat, Deputy Commandant. Thank you, Jim. Also, we are pleased, as John Hayden mentioned, that the spouses of our speakers have been able to make it today. Mrs. Kathleen Easton, Mrs. Marty Frazier. And let me give you a little background on our speakers. Richard Easton is an actuary and currently conducts independent consulting. He has published articles about the origins of GPS in various publications in the past 20 years. Mr. Frazier is a former newspaper correspondent, editor, and has covered government affairs and written articles focusing on computer security, nanotechnology, even drug marketing. Not the type of drugs you're thinking of. And he's also focused on computer security. They are both co-authors of the book, and they'll be available to sign the book after you have personal copies with you after the event in the lobby. So the authors of course, GPS Declassified, from smartphones to smartphones, providing a comprehensive examination of the global positioning system from its origins as a Cold War military program to its emergence as a vital utility that sustains a variety of positioning, navigation, and timing applications for public use in a global capacity. Generals and distinguished visitors, directors and chiefs, ladies and gentlemen, our featured speakers, Mr. Richard Easton, Mr. Eric Frazier.
Thank you all for coming today. General Hyten, thank you so much for having us. We want to thank the Air Force and NSSI for bringing us. There's one person that I want to publicly thank who is not here, and that's Air Force historian Rick Sturtevant. Rick was kind enough to read our manuscript. He provided very valuable feedback to us that made the book a better book. And then he went beyond that and wrote the foreword for the book. And, so we're in his debt. In previous events and interviews, we found we could talk about this subject all day, but I know we only have an hour, so we're going to try to hit the high spots of GPS history and its impact on life today, focusing primarily on the civilian side, the military side. As with choosing a route on your GPS device, our book is just one path through the development of GPS. It's not the only path. It's not the definitive history. This is our story of GPS. And we realize how many of you have had direct involvement in GPS, and at the end, we hope you'll share some of your observations. Slide, please. So, I think you already heard the scope of our book. It's an expansive subject. So there are many approaches that we could have taken to produce a book on GPS. So we decided to focus on tracing GPS from its Cold War military roots to its emergence as a consumer industry and now finally as a vital public utility. We also took a short chapter look back at the history of navigation to put it in context. And we used the last chapter to look at the likely near-term future of GPS, and it's been out for a few years. Our timeline is off. So why did we write the book? We wrote the book for three primary reasons. Next slide, please. I need to be doing this myself. To fill a gap in the literature by assimilating elements of the GPS story scattered among often obscure sources, to address numerous misconceptions and myths that we saw constantly in the popular press, and to raise the awareness of the vast non-military reliance on GPS in hopes of encouraging broader policy engagement by the general public. Now, we're neither security nor policy experts. We came at this from a historical and sociological viewpoint. But we hope that lessons from the past can inform decision-making today. Next slide, please. The major takeaways of our book that we hope people will get from reading it are that space tracking led directly to satellite navigation and GPS, that GPS is the most important navigational advance since John Harrison invented the marine chronometer in the 1700s, and that positioning, navigation, and timing, P&T, and particularly the T in P&T, are now critical to commerce and daily civilian life, making GPS a vital public utility. Next slide, please. So it's worth mentioning how we came to collaborate on this book, because before we started this, Richard and I didn't know each other. In 2009, during the depths of the Great Recession, I found myself unemployed through a job restructuring. And I'd been writing for a university news service covering mostly scientific research and business education. And so I started freelancing, and I thought, well, now I have time to work on a book. I always wanted to write a book. What should I pick for a topic? So I thought, well, it makes sense to combine science and business. And I recall something that my daughter had said to me when she was young driver in high school. She used to get lost all the time. She'd call on her cell phone, we'd pull out a map and direct her to where she wanted to go. And in college, we weren't getting these calls anymore. And one day I said, why don't you call for directions anymore? She says, oh, I went on eBay and I bought a GPS from you and I don't get lost anymore. And then she said the thing that stuck in my mind. She said, whoever invented GPS must be a genius and rich. And so I thought, well, this would be an interesting thing to investigate. And the investigation showed a very complex history and development spanning decades. By February of 2010, I had determined that I really needed to interview Roger Easton. I didn't know if he was still alive or where I might find him. But I found some articles that his son Richard had written, and I found an email address, and I put together a pretty long email and sent it to him. And here I'll let Richard pick up the story.
So, Snowmageddon played a part in the book. Some of you may remember Washington, D.C., middle of February 2010, got 2 feet of snow, and then a couple days later got another foot. Well, Dad was supposed to be inducted into the Inventors Hall of Fame, middle of February. And the Inventors Hall of Fame decided that, these inventors are generally in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Probably not good to have them wandering through 3 feet of snow. So they delayed it to the end of March. Eric contacted me a week after the ceremony was supposed to take place. I'm the tortoise, he's the hare. I'd been working on a book about GPS slowly for about 5 years and had gotten exactly nowhere in terms of finding a publisher. But I told Eric, perhaps we could collaborate. And we talked on the phone. He came out to the induction ceremony at the end of March. He was able to meet my father and a lot of the people who I had interviewed for the book, people like Chester Klezak, who died 3 months later. So it was perfectly timed from that perspective. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of background. The International Geophysical Year was a year and a half, July 57 through December 58. Both the US and the Soviet Union announced in 1955 that they were going to launch a satellite during the IGY. Eisenhower set up the Stewart Committee to decide who would get the nod to launch the first American satellite. All 3 services made proposals, but the Air Force was focused on ICBMs. So the real competition came between Werner von Braun and the Army and Milt Rosen and the Navy. My dad had worked for Milt Rosen on Project Viking, not to be confused with the soft landing on Mars. Project Viking was doing upper atmospheric research, and the Navy won, which surprised the Navy. And Milt Rosen's comment when he walked out was, they've got a rocket and we don't. Well, so the Navy's working on Project Vanguard, trying to get a satellite in orbit, and the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 on October 4th, 1957. The Sputnik 1 weighed about 177 pounds. And then a month later, they launched Sputnik 2, which weighs more than 1,000 pounds and has a dog. So suddenly, Project Vanguard went from being relatively obscure to our response to Sputnik. The first test of all 3 stages, well, only the first stage launch, got the name Flopnik. It launched about 3 feet off the pad and blew up on national TV. So big embarrassment, but the satellite survived. In fact, we have an Air Force Colonel, Asa Gibbs, to thank for the fact that we put a satellite on these test rockets. He said, the full IGY satellites are going to be 20 inches. He said, why don't you put a small satellite on these tests? Then you can get some information if it reaches orbit. So the Navy has an Air Force Colonel to thank for this. You can see this was there. This is the 3.5-pound, 6-inch across TB3 for Test Vehicle 3 satellite. You see the solar cells. It was the first satellite to carry solar cells, except it didn't reach orbit. This is it being disassembled. Marty Votaw and my dad, looking at it on the 50th anniversary of the successful launch of Vanguard 1. Now you notice, again, it's only 3.5 pounds. Khrushchev, the dictator of the Soviet Union, called it the grapefruit. But there's one big advantage about having a small satellite. Next slide, please. All right, here's a more successful launch of Vanguard 1. And this is the satellite in Vanguard 1, which Dad brought home for pictures a week or 2 before its launch. I'm wearing the red coat, and that's my brother and 3 sisters around. That's the oldest satellite in orbit that I'm sitting right next to. This is our home in Oxon Hill, Maryland, just outside Washington. So, Sputnik 1, 177 pounds, that would not have made it home. So, again, Vanguard 1, the solar cells, with both Sputniks 1 and 2 and Explorer use just batteries. And the batteries to power the transmitter, it's weeks or months. The solar cells work for 6 years. So you see solar power today, talking about improving it. You can go back to the grapefruit. Next slide, please. All right, just real briefly, path to satellite navigation, visual aids, compass. You notice as time goes on, we get systems that can be used more quickly and over longer distances. Here's a sextant. Navigating at sea required technological advances, astrolabes, sextants, astronomical charts, accurate clocks. We mentioned the marine chronometer. In the 18th century, you could estimate your latitude by taking observations of the sun or certain stars. Longitude required you to know a time difference, time from when you started versus the current time. The two major ways of doing that were a marine chronometer. If your marine chronometer is on London time, and you know the sun is straight overhead at noon when your marine chronometer says 1 o'clock, you're 1/24th of the way west of London. Or you can take observations of the moons of Jupiter, except that didn't work very well at sea, or you can take lunars measurements. And one thing important here is realizing that as navigation improved, trade improved. The invention of the compass, when that reached the West and was fully developed, suddenly in the Mediterranean Sea, you can sail during the winter. So navigation has always been critical towards improving trade, which has been important to connect the whole world and again, improve the economies. In the 19th century, they discovered high-frequency electromagnetic waves, and again, GPS is using radio waves. Next slide, please. Okay, what did they do before GPS? Some of you may know Ernst Shackleton and his expedition. He was going to try to go across Antarctica. He started just as World War I was breaking out, made its way to South Georgia, 3rd of December, and his ship got crushed in the ice. So they had 3 lifeboats. They dragged the lifeboats across the ice, and then when they reached open sea, they finally made it to Elephant Island. They'd been 1.5 years without setting foot on dry land. Well, Elephant Island's on dry land, but they didn't have cell phones. It was not on the regular whaling route. So if they were going to get rescued, they had to make it to inhabited island. They couldn't head towards Cape Horn because the currents were heading in this way. So Shackleton took 5 other men on the best lifeboat, the James Caird, and he sailed from Elephant Island to South Georgia. And his navigator, Frank Woolsey, was taking sights. He got 3 good sights during the trip, but he said he could not be sure of their position within 10 miles. You know, again, they're in a tiny boat, they're trying to stay alive. So when they spotted South Georgia, they decided, I'm going to land, even though it's on the uninhabited side. And then Shackleton and 2 other men climbed over the interior of South Georgia, which had never been done before. And alpine climbers 50 years later had difficulty doing it with modern equipment. But they said, well, when it's life or death, it's a little different. So again, just navigating using a sextant, you can see the inaccuracy. And by then they had radio direction finding, but obviously on an expedition to Antarctica, you're trying to be as lightweight as possible. So again, Shackleton basically using 19th century methods, managed to find South Georgia and survived. Next slide, please. Some of you may know Arthur C. Clarke. He was author of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was made into the famous Stanley Kubrick film. And he also, in 1945, predicted communication satellites in geosynchronous orbit. Well, in a 1956 letter, he said 3 stations in the 24-hour orbit could provide not only an interference and censorship-free global TV service for the same power as a single modern transmitter, but could also make possible a position-finding grid whereby anyone on Earth could locate himself by means of a couple of dials on an instrument about the size of a watch. And in the letter, he was predicting it within 30 years. Well, GPS, fully operational 1995, so a darn good prediction by Arthur C. Clarke. Next slide, please. All right, the path to satellite navigation. I've already mentioned Sputnik, and with Sputnik, 3 individuals or groups, which I'm going to show in the next slide, they tracked Sputnik, and then they said, we're using ground stations to track a satellite, perhaps we could invert the problem and use satellites to track receivers, or at least give receivers their positions. Next slide, please. This is a presentation by my father in 1967. To my knowledge, the idea of using passive ranging, so again, if you know what time the signal took leaving the satellite, and you know what time you received it, you know, apart from corrections by the ionosphere, et cetera, you know how far you are from the satellite. And with 4 satellites in sight, you can get your 3-dimensional position plus your time. Anyway, he said passive ranging as a navigation technique was a result of a conversation between myself and Dr. Arnold Shostak of ONR. Some of you may know Arnold's son, Seth, who's involved in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. In 1964, Dr. Shostak was explaining how the hydrogen maser worked. Hydrogen maser was developed in 1960 and obtained its fantastic timekeeping ability. At the time, I remarked that this device appeared to make passive ranging feasible. He agreed, and I spent a week working on the idea. So this is the origin of Timation for time navigation. Next slide, please. Space surveillance system was conceived of in January 1958. So at that point, the Soviets had launched Sputnik 1 and 2. People had tracked Sputnik by tracking the transmitter on it. But what would you do for a Soviet spy satellite? Most of the time it would be dark. It would not be transmitted. And Dad had an idea for the space surveillance system in roughly 33 degrees north with 3 transmitter systems in red and 6 in blue. It was about 100 times more powerful than his previous system, Minitrack. And you notice it's east-west. Minitrack was north-south because he figured with Minitrack you were trying to track either Vanguard or, as it turned out, Sputnik. And the early satellites, you were going to launch the rocket east to take advantage of the rotation of the Earth. Obviously, if you're at the equator, you're rotating about 1,000 miles an hour. And you notice Cape Canaveral is about as far in the US as you can get south. So Minitrack, he had north-south, figuring that the satellite would be traveling from west to east. But space surveillance, he had east to west, because he figured a spy satellite would be in a polar orbit. With a polar orbit, as the Earth rotates, you take in the whole Earth. So ARPA, which is now DARPA, started funding this in June of '58, and they tracked the first satellite in August. So things were moving really fast post-Sputnik. But he started a second station in southern Texas to try to get the orbit more quickly with 2 stations. It'd be a true radar. And also, if a satellite exploded into lots of pieces, having 2 stations made it more feasible to track it. But he had the problem that he wanted to synchronize the clocks in these 2 stations. And driving a cesium atomic clock from one station to another, the clock would drift. Transmitting it over the horizon was noisy. So he said, well, why don't I put the clock on a satellite? And it can synchronize both clocks in the 2 stations at once. And then he thought, similar to the earlier show, to the earlier slide, well, hey, I can turn this into a navigation system. And here's the tracking station transmitters at Lake Kickapoo, which was the biggest. That's Lake Kickapoo right here. Next slide, please. So here are some of the navigation proposals in our book. I don't have time to go over all of them, but you notice 3 in particular. Transit was the first operational. George Weifenbach and William Geyer tracked Sputnik using its Doppler, and about 6 months later, their boss said, can you turn that into a navigation system? And they said yes, and transit became fully operational in the 1960s. 2 other people who tracked Sputnik were Roy Anderson at General Electric. He had a proposal for NASA that they launched a couple satellites, but eventually it got overtaken by GPS. And my father, with his mini-track system, also tracked Sputnik. So again, all 3 of these people, they track Sputnik, and then they say, I can invert the problem and use satellites to track receivers. And GPS today combines, it's a synthesis of timation and 621B, which the Air Force Aerospace was developing in the 1960s. Next slide, please. The Joint Chiefs of Staff Navigation Study Panel in 1968, they decided that transit was not good enough. Transit was 2-dimensional, not always available, and they wanted a 3-dimensional, instantaneous, worldwide fixes within a specified accuracy. That was the 1968 requirement. I've never been able to get the original. I think it's 50 feet. And in April 1973, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, William Clements, wrote a memo saying, we're going to establish a joint program office with the Air Force as the lead, and Colonel Brad Parkinson was the first head of the JPO from 73 to 78. Here's Dr. Parkinson, and certainly GPS's success today, he deserves a lot of credit for his skillful leadership of the JPO. Next slide, please. We talked about PNT, and that T is the least known among the public. Time synchronization from GPS. One of the reasons we wrote the book was I kept on reading that the T part was not foreseen early on, which is not correct. In an article in 1974, Roger Easton said, precise orbiting clocks will prove to be a valuable tool in a variety of applications by providing the entire planet Earth with a single accurate time system, enveloping the globe in a web of synchronized satellite signals. So again, the T part was foreseen. And fiber optic cables, financial trading, it's truly a web of synchronized satellite signals. Next slide, please. The first GPS demonstration constellation, again, you need 4 satellites to give you 3D position plus time, included the NTS-2 and the first 3 Block 1 test satellites. This was in 1978. So again, it was showing GPS would work. Next slide, please. This is instantaneous navigation.